Spring in Wyoming was always restless, too warm for snow, too cold for peace. Out beyond the Powder River, the grass was just starting to show its green again. And in the half-light of dawn, a single rider crested a ridge near the KC Ranch. His name was Nate Champion, a small-time cowboy with a big heart and not much else. He squinted into the distance, watching a line of dust moving where no herd should have been. Down in the valley, the others were still sleeping. The smell of cold coffee and wood smoke clung to the air. Nate slid from his saddle, his boots sinking in the wet earth, and listened. It was faint, but it was there, the steady thud of hooves, many of them. Not a passing drive, not neighbors. This was something organized. The sound had a rhythm, the kind only trained men carried. He stepped back to his horse and whispered, "Company's coming." That morning, the sky was pale and hard as iron. Clouds built on the horizon like walls. Nate checked his rifle, ran a thumb across the worn brass of the cartridges, and waited. Out here you didn't get warnings, just moments. And in those moments, a man's choices wrote his history. By the time the first riders came into view, the sun was breaking over the bighorns. They rode in tight formation, strangers, their hats pulled low, their coats long and dark against the light. One of them carried a list in his pocket with names on it. Nate Champions was near the top. In town, 80 miles south, men in tailored coats were already reading telegrams, sipping coffee, talking about cleaning up the rustlers. They called themselves the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, the biggest cattle interest west of Chicago. For years, they'd built an empire on the open range, running tens of thousands of head under brands that marked the sky as much as the hide. But lately, their empire had begun to fray. Fences went up, homesteads spread, and men like Nate started branding their own cattle. Small marks, honest ones, made with burned hands and borrowed iron. The barons didn't like that. They said the little men were thieves, rustlers who cut calves from their herds, changed brands under moonlight, and sold stolen beef to rail buyers in Cheyenne. The truth was simpler and harder. The small cowboys were surviving the only way they could. They'd carved a living from land the barons claimed to own but never really touched. So when the spring roundups of 1892 approached, the big ranchers decided to send a message. Not with words, not with courts, but with bullets. The first signs came quiet. Storekeepers noticing strangers buying ammunition in bulk, telegraph lines humming with coded chatter. Men in Buffalo, the county seat, whispered of an invasion. Still, most folks laughed it off. Nobody believed the stockmen would go that far. But up at the KC Ranch, Nate was staring down that reality. He watched through the cracks in the barn wall as the dust cloud grew larger. He counted maybe 50 riders, maybe more. They moved with purpose, rifles slung easy on their shoulders. He could feel it in his gut. This wasn't a roundup. This was an execution. Inside, two hired hands stirred from their bunks. Nate told them to get the horses ready and ride for help. "Go to Buffalo," he said. "Tell them the invaders are here." They hesitated. He looked them in the eye, steady and calm. "Go, I'll hold them as long as I can." It was the kind of thing a man said without thinking, without expecting to live through it. Just something you do because it feels right, because if you don't, nobody else will. By mid-morning, the riders had formed a circle around the ranch house. One of them shouted through a megaphone, his voice flat and practiced, ordering the men inside to surrender. Nate leaned his rifle on the windowsill, heart pounding slow and even. "Tell him to come take it," he muttered. The first shot cracked through the still air, and the war for Johnson County began. Smoke rolled from the rifle's muzzle, echoing against the low hills. The attackers returned fire, bullets slicing through the clapboard siding and kicking splinters into the room. Nate ducked low, fired again. The world shrank to the rhythm of aim and breath. Outside, his horse screamed and went down. For hours, the siege continued. The attackers set the corral on fire, hoping to drive him out, but Nate held his ground. Between volleys, he scribbled notes in a small diary, recording what was happening, not for glory, but maybe so someone would know how it started. The wind carried the smell of burnt hay and gunpowder. Birds fled the trees. The plains, usually so open, felt like a trap now. Somewhere a cow bawled in the distance, the sound of life carrying on, even as men tried to erase it. In Buffalo, word reached the saloon around noon. A breathless rider burst through the doors, shouting that the cattle barons' hired guns had come. Within an hour, ranchers were saddling up, loading rifles, calling for men. The law might have been bought, but the land still belonged to those who worked it. Back at the KC Ranch, Nate could see the smoke thickening outside the window. He knew the end was coming, but he wasn't about to let the barons write the first chapter of this war. He raised his rifle one more time and whispered, "All right, boys, let's finish this proper." The flame reached the roof. The shots grew fewer, but closer. And somewhere inside that burning cabin, history took a deep breath. Because after this day, after Nate Champion's stand, the small cowboys of Wyoming would never be the same. They would rise, armed not just with rifles but with reason. They would fight for their name, for their work, for the right to exist under the same sky as the men who claimed to own it. And as the smoke from the KC Ranch curled into the Wyoming wind, it carried with it the first true spark of rebellion, a sign that the age of the cattle barons was beginning to crack. The storm had broken. The range would never be quiet again. Before the smoke had even cleared from the KC Ranch, the story of how it came to this was already older than most of the men who fought in it. For nearly 2 decades, the plains of Wyoming had been ruled not by law or government but by cattle and the men who owned them. It began right after the Civil War, when the open range stretched from Texas to Montana and grass was free for anyone with the nerve to claim it. Those who arrived first, former soldiers, wealthy speculators, railroad men, saw an empire waiting to be fenced. They came with capital and confidence, and they built what they called the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. It started simple enough, a cooperative to share brands, protect herds, and organize roundups. But by the 1880s, it had become something much larger, an unofficial government backed by bankers in Chicago and politicians in Cheyenne. They controlled the land leases, the water rights, the grazing permits, and the very newspapers that printed the news. Every major decision west of the Black Hills passed through their boardrooms. They called it progress. The cowhands who worked their ranges called it tyranny. From the town of Cheyenne, their power radiated outward like spokes from a wheel. Brick offices rose where once there had been tents, and in those offices men like Major Frank Walcott, Ed Towse, and William C. Irvine signed their names to fortunes. They rode in carriages while their hired riders worked the frozen line camps for $40 a month. But the barons weren't bad men in their own eyes. They were builders. They saw themselves as tamers of chaos, protectors of order in a wild, lawless land. In their minds, the open range was too valuable to leave to small dreamers with 1 cow and a rifle. So they formed a system that favored the few. In the early years, when spring came, the big ranches would drive their herds north across the open grasslands, branding new calves as they went. There were no fences, no real boundaries, only rivers, canyons, and the memory of where your cattle last grazed. But as the territory filled, that memory began to fail. Cattle mixed, brands blurred, and the gray area between ownership and opportunity widened. By 1886, the problem had turned into a weapon. That year brought the Great Die-Up, one of the worst winters in frontier history. Temperatures dropped to 40 below. Cattle froze where they stood, their bodies stacked like driftwood against the fences and creek beds. When the thaw came, tens of thousands were dead, and the big outfits were ruined. But the small ranchers, the men who kept their herds close and fed, managed to survive. For the first time, the giants of the range had been humbled. They didn't forgive it. The following years were marked by resentment. The barons began accusing every independent rancher of rustling. Newspapers they owned printed lists of known thieves. But those names were ordinary men, Nate Champion among them, whose only crime was branding a calf they'd found wandering unmarked after the storm. It didn't matter. To the association, anyone outside their control was a threat to the old order, and threats needed to be erased. In Cheyenne, the WSGA built its own private detective network. Men who rode under the pretense of range inspectors but carried the authority of executioners. They patrolled the plains, questioning, searching, and sometimes hanging men without trial. When the courts hesitated, the stock growers paid new ones into office. When juries acquitted, they bought newspapers to rewrite the verdicts. To outsiders, Wyoming looked civilized, ranches thriving, railroads expanding, the territory preparing for statehood. But inside that illusion, the line between justice and business was gone. Every fence post driven by a small rancher was an act of defiance. Every calf branded with a new mark was a challenge to the empire. The small cowboys noticed. They formed their own associations, their own meetings in dusty barns and county halls, where they spoke in low voices about fairness and survival. They were men who lived with their hands cracked from rope burns, men who'd buried friends in frozen ground. They didn't want war, but they could feel it coming. The cattle barons, sitting in Cheyenne's grand hotels with cigars and imported whiskey, read reports from their foremen and inspectors. They told stories of outlaw bands, of organized theft, of danger to their property. None of it was truly proven, but fear has a way of buying certainty when money is behind it. And so in the winter of 1891, they met in secret at the Cheyenne Club. Behind heavy doors and velvet curtains, the decision was made. A punitive expedition would be formed. They called it an invasion. 50 hired gunmen from Texas would be brought north by train, equipped with Winchesters, Colts, and a kill list of supposed rustlers. Major Walcott would lead them. Each target's name was chosen carefully. Small men, isolated men, those without political allies or large families. The mission's aim was not justice but fear. They meant to remind Wyoming who owned the grass, the rivers, and the sky. By April 1892, the trains rolled quietly into Casper under night cover. The gunmen unloaded their crates of rifles and rode north. They moved through the cold dawn like a shadow army, silent, determined, well-paid. Behind them, telegrams flickered through the wires, sending one final message to the Cheyenne Club: the work begins. They believed they were marching to restore order. They didn't know they were marching into history's reckoning. They weren't outlaws, not in the way the papers wrote them. They were sons of settlers and drifters, men who came west with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, and the hope of carving out a patch of land that could feed them through winter. They lived along creeks and coulees, in cabins made of cottonwood and mud, roofs patched with tin and prayer. In summer, they rode the range from sunup to dark. In winter, they huddled around stoves that smoked more than they warmed. But through it all, they held one thing sacred: their independence. A man like Nate Champion didn't have much to lose but his name, and in the West, that was everything. To call a man a rustler was to hang a noose around his neck before the trial ever began. Still, the small ranchers tried to live by the code of the range: ride honest, brand what's yours, help a neighbor in need. They'd come west for freedom, not for charity. The Barons had money, the Cowboys had grit, and out on that open country, grit still meant something. Their lives ran on the rhythm of the land. Spring was branding season, smoke from irons rising like ghosts across the plains. Summer meant long drives to the railheads, sleeping in dust, mending fences, and praying the storm stayed away. Autumn brought the roundups, the counting of calves, the tally that decided whether a man would make it through winter or sell his last cow to buy flour. And winter, that was when time slowed, when a man had to fight the cold and the silence more than any rival. They didn't live by books or politics. Most couldn't vote, and few had ever seen a courthouse. Their world was measured in miles of range, in the cut of a saddle, in the feel of rope against leather palms. Their law was trust, and once it was broken, it stayed broken. So when the cattle barons started spreading rumors, when they accused honest men of theft, it struck deep. In the town of Buffalo, you could feel the divide like a wound. The stock growers' men drank in one saloon, the small ranchers drank in another. A glance could start a fight, a word could start a feud. The local sheriff tried to stay neutral, but neutrality doesn't last long when money takes sides. The association's influence ran through every courthouse and telegraph line. Still, the little men held together, bound by something older than politics: survival. Among them were names that history would almost forget: Bill Red Angus, John Tisdale, Nick Ray, and of course, Nate Champion. They worked side by side, shared tobacco, split coffee rations, and talked about the future like it might actually come. They dreamed small: a few more head of cattle, a barn that didn't leak, a winter without burying a friend. In a land built on illusion, their dreams were the only real thing. They had wives, too. Women tougher than rawhide, who mended clothes, kept gardens alive in dry soil, and prayed that each gunshot in the distance wasn't the sound of their husband's last stand. They knew what the cattle barons' words meant. They'd seen men accused of rustling vanish without trial. They'd heard stories of bodies found near creek beds, left for coyotes. But they stayed, because the land had a hold on them stronger than fear. Sometimes on calm evenings, you could hear a harmonica drifting from one of the line shacks. The sound carried across the sagebrush, lonely and human. It wasn't about music, it was about reminding yourself you were still alive, still fighting to stay that way. Out there, where the horizon never ended, a man's song was all the proof he had that he existed. When talk of an invasion reached them, few believed it. The idea that rich men in Cheyenne would hire killers to wipe out homesteaders sounded like something from the old days, before statehood, before law. But whispers grew louder. Telegrams were intercepted. Travelers spoke of strange men on the trails, armed and tight-lipped. The small cowboys started keeping their rifles closer, their horses saddled at night. In the town's small blacksmith shop, men gathered under the pretense of shoeing horses. But what they really did was plan. If the association meant to bring war, they'd meet it. They drew maps, marked water crossings, counted ammunition. It wasn't much, just farmers and cowhands with old rifles and stubborn hearts. But it was something. They weren't fighting for power or pride. They were fighting to keep the right to live and work without permission. The irony was heavy. The same men the barons called thieves were the ones who had built Wyoming's reputation. The cowboys who rode the hard trails, who brought beef to the rails, who faced blizzards and isolation without complaint. Those were the ones being branded as criminals. And in that quiet injustice, something ancient stirred. By late March, you could feel the air tighten. The land itself seemed to wait. Storms gathered over the bighorns, thunder rolling like distant hooves. Cattle huddled near windbreaks. Every man in Johnson County knew it. Something was coming. The small cowboys sharpened their knives, cleaned their guns, and kept watch over their herds. They didn't talk much about fear. Out there, words wasted energy. But when they looked toward the southern trails, toward the unseen riders moving up from Casper, every man felt the same cold truth settling in his chest. They'd worked too hard and lost too much to give up now. The range might belong to the barons on paper, but the land remembered the hands that had bled on it. And when the time came, those hands would answer. The plains were quiet, the stars hard and bright. Somewhere in the dark, a horse snorted, sensing movement beyond the ridge. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke and gun oil. The small cowboys were ready. By the late 1880s, the word rustler had become a weapon sharper than any blade. It started as a term for thieves, real ones, men who cut brands under darkness or ran off strays from a neighbor's herd. But the cattle barons of Wyoming turned it into something else entirely. To them, a rustler was anyone who stood in their way, anyone who branded his own cattle, fenced his own pasture, or refused to bow to their rules. The newspapers they owned filled their pages with it. Rustlers infest Johnson County, honest stockmen threatened by outlaws. It was a story that suited them well, because it made murder look like justice. In Cheyenne, editors printed tales of invisible bands of cattle thieves hiding in the hills, led by men with names like Nate Champion or Nick Ray. They never saw them, but that didn't matter. Fear spreads faster than proof. To the bankers in Chicago, it was comforting. Justification for investing more money in the association's private army. To the politicians, it meant votes and order. And to the barons themselves, it meant control. But out on the range, the truth was different. The supposed rustlers were just small men running herds of 50 or 60 head, scraping through winters that could break a man's will. When they branded a calf that didn't carry a mark, they weren't stealing, they were surviving. The big outfits had more cattle than they could count, and in the spring roundups, hundreds of unbranded calves drifted loose. The range was vast and memory short, but the Stock Growers Association didn't care about the truth. They cared about power. They kept lists, typed official-looking lists of known rustlers. Each name was gathered from rumor or grudges, whispered by paid informants who'd trade a neighbor's life for a handful of dollars. Once your name was written down, you were finished. You might not know it yet, but death was already riding your way. The stock growers used the myth to build an image of heroism. They called themselves defenders of law and property, men who kept the West safe for honest business. But the irony was cruel. It was their own greed that had brought chaos to Wyoming. They overstocked the ranges, drove cattle into ground that couldn't hold them, and then blamed the small men when the grass disappeared. When the great die-up came, it wasn't the rustlers who caused the losses. It was nature and arrogance. Yet the barons never looked inward. They looked outward, and the rustler myth gave them someone to blame. The smaller ranchers tried to fight the lie with words. They wrote letters to the Buffalo Bulletin explaining their side, naming their witnesses. But ink dries faster than it spreads, and by the time the truth reached Cheyenne, the headlines had already done their work. Eastern investors believed the story. They sent more money, more rifles, more reason for the association to finish what it had begun. Sheriffs were caught in the middle. Some, like William Red Angus in Johnson County, sided quietly with the settlers, knowing the accusations were false. Others kept their distance, afraid of losing their jobs or worse. Justice became a language spoken only by those who could afford to print it. In taverns and bunkhouses, men began to talk in lower tones. The word rustler was no longer spoken with anger, but with caution. A man could wake up honest one morning and be an outlaw by sundown. If the wrong person said his name, it was a sickness, a paranoia that crept into every handshake and every deal. By early 1892, the myth had hardened into policy. The association began to act like a government unto itself, issuing warrants, sending inspectors armed with rifles, even building a secret jail near Casper. They said it was for thieves, but everyone knew it was for the poor. And then came the final twist. The very cowboys who once worked for the big outfits, who'd driven their herds through blizzards and fought off real rustlers, began to turn against them. They'd seen too much, the unfair roundups, the false branding claims, the way a man's name could be ruined with a whisper. They started drifting toward the small ranchers, toward men like Nate Champion. Loyalty on the range was earned, not bought, and the barons had forgotten that. One night in a cabin near the Powder River, a group of those cowboys gathered. They sat around a lantern, faces tired but determined. On the table lay a newspaper clipping, accusing Nate of leading a rustler gang. The men read it in silence. Then one of them, no one remembers who, spoke. If that's what they're calling rustlers now, then maybe it's time we show them what honest rustlers can do. It wasn't a call to theft. It was a call to dignity. They wouldn't go looking for blood, but if the barons brought it to them, they'd answer. The rustler myth had done what the cattle barons never intended. It had united the scattered, the poor and the proud under one banner. Men who barely knew each other began to ride together, share supplies, plan for the worst. The word that once divided them now bound them. Meanwhile, in Cheyenne, telegrams flashed through the wires again. Plans were set, funds transferred, horses bought. The barons had finished their lists, and the gunmen were already on the move. The lie had become too large to contain. It needed blood to make it real. And in that quiet before dawn, as frost gathered on the prairie grass and the sky began to pale, Wyoming held its breath, because once the first shot was fired, there'd be no going back. Not for the cattle barons, not for the Cowboys, not for the West itself. They came quietly, under the cover of early spring fog, carrying more ammunition than reason. 50 men, most of them Texans hardened by border wars and cattle drives, hired not for their conscience but for their aim. They were promised $5 a day and a bonus for every rustler they eliminated. Their orders were typed, signed, and sealed by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, an official crusade dressed in private vengeance. The locals would later call them what they were, the invaders. On April 5, 1892, they loaded their gear onto a train in Cheyenne, 50 Winchester rifles, 2 Gatling guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and a list of names that read like a death warrant. Among those names were Nate Champion, Nick Ray, and a handful of men whose only crime was owning land the cattle barons wanted back. The train moved north under false papers, its carriages labeled as supplies. No one in the stations along the way knew what kind of cargo it carried. At midnight near Casper, the train slowed to a halt. The men disembarked in silence, their breath visible in the cold air. Horses waited, already saddled. They split their gear, checked their rifles, and mounted up under the orders of Major Frank Wolcott, a Civil War veteran rigid and sure of his mission. His face gave nothing away. He believed, as the barons did, that this was not murder but restoration, the cleansing of a lawless land. Behind him rode Tom Horn, a name whispered with both fear and respect, though history would later stretch his legend far beyond this night. Horn was a tracker and marksman, a man who could find anyone and end anything. To the association, he was the perfect hound. They rode north through the darkness, avoiding towns and ranches, following the Powder River Trail. The night was black as coal, broken only by the occasional flicker of a lantern as one man checked his horse's reins or adjusted his hat. In the distance, wolves called from the foothills, the only witnesses to what was coming. For 3 days they rode, crossing icy creeks and sagebrush flats, eating jerky from their saddlebags and sleeping in shifts. They spoke little. Some were veterans of other dirty jobs in Texas, men who'd worked as range detectives or bounty hunters. A few had no idea what they were truly hired for until it was too late to turn back. But by the time they reached the northern counties, it didn't matter. The plan was in motion, and the pay was too good to question. Their orders were clear. Ride to Johnson County, surround the homes of the listed men, and kill every one of them. Burn their property, scatter their herds, and leave no trace that could lead back to Cheyenne. It was to be swift and silent. A strike so decisive that no cowboy in Wyoming would dare stand against the stock growers again. But Wyoming was not Texas. The land here was vast and untamed, its people bound not by fear but by pride. Every mile north brought the invaders closer to men who had spent their lives watching the horizon, reading the signs of weather and strangers. Word traveled faster than horses in these parts, and by the time the invaders reached Powder River, a few ranchers had already noticed unfamiliar riders. They didn't speak, but their eyes followed. On April 8, the invaders made camp near the middle fork of Crazy Woman Creek. The night was cold, the stars sharp as nails. Around the fire, they opened a packet of papers, the official list of rustlers to be executed. One of the men read it aloud. Champion, Ray, Tisdale, Jones. Names that would soon be burned into history. A few of the hired guns shifted uneasily. They'd signed on for work, not a massacre. But the leaders reminded them, these weren't men. They said they were thieves, outlaws, vermin. The justification was as old as power itself. At dawn, Major Wolcott stood apart from the group, his breath fogging in the chill. He looked north toward the hills of Johnson County, where smoke from homestead chimneys rose thin and calm. He tightened his gloves and gave the order to ride. Their first target lay ahead, the KC Ranch, where Nate Champion was said to be hiding. The plan was simple: strike before daylight, surround the cabin, and finish it quick. No mercy, no witnesses. They rode hard through the morning fog, the sound of hooves muffled in the wet grass. The sun had barely crested the Bighorn Mountains when they reached the valley. The cabin stood small and still among the cottonwoods, smoke curling lazily from the stovepipe. There was a horse in the corral, and a saddle left by the door, signs of life. The invaders dismounted and spread out, rifles drawn. One of them raised a field glass, scanning the windows. "He's in there," he whispered. Major Walcott nodded once. And then, just as they were about to move, a flicker of movement caught their eye. Nate Champion stepped out of the doorway, stretching, unaware of the men hidden in the trees. The invaders froze. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then Walcott gave the signal. A single rifle cracked through the morning air. Nate dove back inside. The sound echoed across the valley, rolling like thunder against the hills. The siege had begun. Inside that small cabin, one man and a handful of friends faced 50 armed riders, the embodiment of power and greed. And though they didn't know it yet, their stand would ignite the powder keg that the whole of Wyoming had been sitting on for years. Out on the ridges, cowhands and settlers would soon see the smoke rising and understand the war had come. The invaders thought they were bringing order to the range, but by the time the day ended, they would awaken a fury that not even the cattle barons could control. The light came slow that morning, a thin gray ribbon stretching across the high plains. The air smelled of damp earth and gun oil. Inside the small cabin of the KC Ranch, Nate Champion stirred the coals in the stove, unaware that the last calm breath of his life was slipping past him. Outside, 50 rifles waited in the trees. The invaders lay silent, their horses tethered among the brush, steam rising from their nostrils. Each man watched that cabin door like a predator studying its prey. At 6 a.m., Nate stepped out to check the corral. His breath fogged the air. A hawk circled above the cottonwoods, crying once before gliding toward the ridge. The prairie was still, too still. Then the silence cracked. The first shot ripped through the cold morning, echoing off the low hills. The bullet missed him by inches, striking the post beside his head. Splinters flew. Nate threw himself back through the doorway and shouted, "We're surrounded." Inside, Nick Ray and 2 ranch hands scrambled to their rifles. The cabin walls were rough-hewn logs, good for wind but not for bullets. Lead tore through the wood, sending clouds of dust and bark flying through the air. The men hit the floor. Outside, the invaders fanned out, tightening the circle. Their leader, Major Walcott, barked orders through the smoke. "Keep them pinned. Burn them out if you have to." The siege had begun in earnest. Bullets screamed through the walls. Nate's horse was hit in the corral, collapsing with a terrible groan. The smell of blood filled the air. Inside, Nate reloaded, calm and deliberate, his fingers black with powder. Between shots, he called out to the men outside, his voice steady and defiant. "Come and get me, you sons of bitches." Hours passed like minutes. Every window was shattered, every board scarred. Nick Ray took a bullet to the stomach just after noon. He fell near the stove, clutching his side, whispering something no one could hear. Nate dragged him to safety, wrapped him in a blanket, and went back to the fight. He fired through the smoke until the rifle barrel burned his hand. The invaders advanced in waves, using fallen logs for cover, firing as they moved. Each time they closed in, Nate drove them back with quick, precise shots. His marksmanship was legendary among the local cowboys, and now it showed. One by one, the attackers fell or retreated to reload. Still, the numbers were too great. Around mid-afternoon, they set fire to the corral, hoping to smoke him out. Flames licked the dry grass, and the heat pushed against the cabin walls. Nate coughed through the haze, tearing a piece of wet cloth and tying it around his face. He opened the window just enough to see the enemy's positions and fired again. He was alone now. Nick Ray had gone still. The others who'd been with them had slipped out through the brush early on and were racing for Buffalo to bring help. Inside that cabin, the sound of gunfire became rhythm. Boom, crack, reload, breathe. Nate began writing between volleys, recording what was happening in a small pocket notebook. His handwriting was rough, words tilted from the jolt of explosions. "Boys are firing again. I am all alone now. I think they intend to burn me out. I will do the best I can." Outside, the invaders grew impatient. The smoke from the burning corral drifted over the valley, signaling to anyone within miles that something terrible was happening. Walcott ordered more firewood piled near the walls. "We end it today," he said coldly. As the flames climbed higher, the sound of Nate's rifle echoed fewer and farther between. The air inside the cabin turned thick and hot. Sparks fell from the ceiling. He wiped the sweat from his face and took one last look through the window. Through the haze, he saw them coming, dozens of riders closing in for the kill. He fired twice, maybe 3 times, before a bullet struck his shoulder, spinning him back. He staggered but didn't fall. "Come on then," he shouted. The fire broke through the roof. Smoke rolled like thunder. Outside, the invaders hesitated, afraid to enter. Nate stood in the middle of the room, the diary still open on the table, its pages curling from the heat. He wrote his last line, "The house is all afire. Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again. When he stepped through the door, the cabin was an inferno. Flames framed him in orange light, rifle in hand, hat low over his eyes. For a second, the invaders froze, struck by the sight of him, a single man walking out of hell. Then they opened fire. The shots echoed through the valley and faded into the wind. When the smoke cleared, the KC ranch was gone. The cabin lay in ashes, the corral blackened. The invaders found Nate's body near the doorway, his rifle empty, his face calm. Beside him lay the notebook, half-burned but legible enough for the words to survive. They buried him in the dirt nearby without ceremony, then gathered their horses and prepared to move north. But the damage was already done. A rider had escaped the siege, carrying word to Buffalo. By the time the invaders mounted up, the county was stirring. The small cowboys, the settlers, the blacksmiths and ranch wives, all of them were about to learn what had happened to Nate Champion, and they would not forgive it. The sound of their anger was already rising over the plains. By the time the sun began to sink behind the bighorns, the valley around the KC ranch had turned the color of rust. Smoke coiled upward from the smoldering ruin, a lonely black column twisting against the pale sky. The invaders stood watching, their faces lit by the dying fire, silent and uneasy. They had come to Johnson County to make an example, to cleanse the land of what they called thieves. But what they saw in that burning cabin was something they hadn't expected. One man holding off 50. One man who refused to bow. Inside those logs, while bullets hammered the walls, Nate Champion had written history by hand. His notebook, later recovered from the ashes, read like a soldier's last confession, calm, clear, resigned. They have killed Nick. I am alone now. I think they mean to burn me out. Boys, I will fight as long as I can. Each word carved into paper with the steadiness of a man who had already accepted his death. It wasn't courage in the way stories like to tell it, not reckless or loud, but the quiet kind, the kind that lives in the marrow of a man who refuses to give up his place in the world. For hours he had fought, reloading in the half-dark, coughing through smoke so thick it turned daylight to dusk. He'd counted his bullets, checked his aim, and kept his mind fixed on one thing: hold them off long enough for the others to reach help. That was all he wanted. Not survival, just time. Every shot he fired bought a heartbeat for the men riding to Buffalo. Every breath he took carried a message across the plains. The invaders had underestimated him. To them, Nate Champion was a name on a list, a problem to be erased. They didn't know he'd grown up under the same sky that was now burning above him, that he'd spent his life working the same cattle they claimed to own. He knew every trick of the land, how sound carried across the flats, how wind direction could hide or reveal a man. He'd fought blizzards that could freeze flesh to bone, broken horses meaner than any hired gun. This was just another storm. As the day dragged on, their gunfire slowed. Ammunition ran low, tempers frayed. Major Wolcott cursed his men for their hesitation. "It's one man," he shouted. "One man in a box of wood." But even his voice cracked under the weight of what they were witnessing. Because deep down, every man among them knew. It wasn't just one man they were fighting. It was something older, harder to kill, defiance itself. When the fire finally took hold, the logs popping like gunshots, Nate could feel the heat at his back. He knew the end had come. The roof groaned above him, the floorboards glowing red. He opened his notebook again and wrote his last line, his handwriting still steady despite the smoke. "Goodbye, boys, if I never see you again." Then he set the book down on the table, checked his rifle one last time, and stood up. Outside, the invaders watched the roof collapse, sparks flying into the gray sky. For a moment, all was quiet. Then a figure moved in the doorway. Nate, wrapped in flame and smoke, rifle in hand. He stepped out slow, deliberate, as though walking into another day's work. A few of the Texans froze, unsure whether they were seeing a ghost. He raised the rifle, fired once, maybe twice, before the bullet struck him down. He fell forward onto the blackened earth. The shooting stopped. Even the wind seemed to pause. For a long minute, no one moved. Then one of the invaders approached, hat in hand, staring down at what was left of the man they had come to destroy. "That son of a bitch died game," he muttered. They buried him there beside the ruins, under a rough wooden cross. No sermon, no words, just the sound of shovels in the dirt. But out on the horizon, the smoke of that fire carried farther than any bullet ever could. It drifted across the plains, across creeks and cattle trails, into the small towns and ranch houses of Johnson County. And with it came the story told first as rumor, then as fact, then as legend. By nightfall, riders from Buffalo were already in the saddle. They told of how the cattle barons had sent killers to murder small ranchers, how one man had stood alone against them for hours. The word spread like wildfire, igniting something the stock growers could never put out. Men who had once stayed silent now rode with rifles across their saddles. Farmers, drifters, and ex-cowhands alike swore vengeance for Nate Champion. The invaders, still riding north, began to hear the rumors of their own doom. At every creek crossing, they saw more riders in the distance. Men watching, following, gathering. The air itself seemed to turn against them. That night, as the stars blinked cold and sharp, Wyoming changed. The myth of the cattle barons, their order, their power, their right to rule began to crack like the burning timbers of Nate's cabin. Because a man's death, when it's honest, can outlive every lie told about him. In the end, Nate Champion did not save himself, but he saved something greater. The belief that a man's worth wasn't measured by wealth or influence, but by how long he could stand when the odds were impossible. His last fight was a mirror held up to the West itself, hard, lonely, defiant, and unbroken. And by morning, the men of Johnson County would be riding toward war. The word hit Buffalo like a hammer. By the time the smoke from the KC Ranch faded into the horizon, riders were galloping into town, breathless and shouting that the invaders had killed Nate Champion and Nick Ray. Every saloon, every store, every boarding house emptied into the muddy street. Men dropped their cards, left their tools, grabbed rifles from walls still warm from the morning stove. In less than an hour, the whole town was alive with the sound of saddles being thrown, cartridges clinking into belts, and the sharp ring of horseshoes on frozen ground. The stock growers had called it an invasion. The people of Johnson County called it murder. Sheriff Red Angus, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like a drum, stood on the courthouse steps, reading the telegram that confirmed what everyone already feared. "They killed Nate Champion," he said, his voice low and shaking with rage. 50 of them, hired killers, sent from Cheyenne. For a moment there was silence. Then someone shouted from the crowd, "To hell with Cheyenne!" The rest followed like a storm breaking, a roar of anger that rolled through the street, through the alleys, into the open fields beyond. Within the hour, the call went out to every homestead and ranch in the county. Riders took off in every direction, galloping through rain and snowmelt, their voices echoing across the plains. "The barons have come, they've killed Champion." By nightfall, more than 200 men were on the move. Some armed with old muskets, others with Winchester repeaters passed down from the war. Most wore no uniforms, just dust and resolve. At the Occidental Hotel, one of the town's few two-story buildings, the women gathered supplies, flour, jerky, coffee, and cartridges. They wrapped them in sacks and handed them out to every rider who passed through. One young woman tied a red kerchief around her husband's arm before he rode out. "So I'll know you," she said. He smiled, though both of them knew she might never see him again. The town blacksmith stayed up through the night, hammering horseshoes until sparks danced off the anvil. In the livery stables, men who'd never fired a shot in anger were cleaning rifles, testing triggers, listening to the older ones talk about courage as if it were something you could forge like iron. By morning, the posse had grown into an army. Ranchers, cowhands, farmers, even a few merchants and school teachers, all gathered under the same cause. They called themselves the Regulators, a name borrowed from frontier justice, but what they wanted was something simpler: revenge. Sheriff Angus rode at the head of them, his red beard bright in the cold wind. Behind him, a banner of dust rose over the plain, marking the largest armed gathering Wyoming had ever seen. They moved north toward the Powder River, following the tracks of the invaders. Each mile brought more men: a ranch hand from Casey, a trapper from Crazy Woman Creek, a father and son from the foothills. By the time they reached the forks of Clear Creek, the posse numbered nearly 400. The land itself seemed to carry their anger. The grass bent under hoofbeats. The wind cut sharp against their faces. They didn't sing or talk much, just rode, silent and grim. Every man among them had seen what the cattle barons could do, how money could twist the law until it strangled the poor. But now, for once, the numbers were on their side. Somewhere ahead, the invaders were moving slow, burdened by their wagons and fear. The Regulators knew it. They could smell their trail: smoke, gunpowder, the faint sour tang of burned wood. And though few had ever met Nate Champion, they all knew what his stand meant. He was one of theirs, one of the small ones who worked harder, earned less, and still stood tall. His death had turned them from neighbors into soldiers. That night they made camp near the Crazy Woman Crossing. The stars hung low and sharp, and the fires burned small to keep from giving away their position. Around those fires, men spoke quietly of what was coming. Some prayed, others sharpened knives, others stared into the dark, seeing in their minds the faces of the men who'd killed Nate. The sheriff walked among them, his boots crunching on frozen grass, stopping now and then to rest a hand on a shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "tomorrow we finish this." In Buffalo, the telegraph operator sent a message eastward, though he didn't know if it would ever reach the right ears. Citizens of Johnson County have armed themselves. They are pursuing invaders toward TA Ranch. Situation grave. And it was grave, because the invaders had underestimated not just one man, but a whole people. They thought the small cowboys would scatter like dust. Instead, they had united like storm clouds. For the first time, the powerful were the ones on the run. By dawn, the posse rode out again, hundreds of hooves drumming against the earth. Ahead lay the Powder River country, rough land, broken by gullies and creeks. Somewhere in those hills, the invaders were digging in, fortifying a ranch they'd seized as a stronghold. The wind was biting, the sky iron gray, and from the front of the column came a single voice calling back through the line, "For champion!" The shout was answered by 100 throats, then 100 more, until the cry rolled like thunder across the plains. They rode faster. The war that the barons had brought to Wyoming was no longer theirs to control. It belonged now to the people who had been silent too long, who had been called rustlers, drifters, nobodies. They were riding not for power or pay, but for something deeper, the right to be left alone, to work, to live, to die on their own land without permission. Ahead, the faint smoke of the TA ranch rose against the morning light. The invaders were there, barricaded and waiting. The county had risen. The reckoning was about to begin. By the morning of April 11, 1892, the plains had turned from white frost to red dust under the pounding of hooves. The invaders had reached the TA ranch 20 miles south of Buffalo, and they were exhausted, hollow-eyed, half-mad from sleeplessness and guilt. Their horses stumbled with foam at the bit. Behind them, the rising dust cloud of the pursuing Johnson County posse loomed like an omen. The hunters had become the hunted. Major Walcott rode through the ranch gates barking orders, his voice hoarse. "Pull the wagons inside. Get the rifles ready." The ranch belonged to a man named Tisdale, one of the small cattlemen already marked on their kill list. His property now served as their last fortress. They broke apart barns, tore down fences, and piled wagon wheels against windows to create firing ports. Every corner of the place became a barricade. The invaders were cornered and they knew it. There were 46 left, and most had barely a handful of cartridges each. Some muttered about surrender, others cursed them as cowards. Walcott tried to hold them together, but the truth pressed on him like a loaded rifle. The range they thought they owned was now surrounding them, closing in. By noon, the horizon began to shimmer with movement. Riders, dozens at first, then hundreds, appeared over the low hills. The posse had arrived. 400 men, armed and angry, their rifles glinting under the pale sun. They spread across the ridges and coulees, forming a half circle around the ranch, cutting off every escape route. From his vantage point on the porch, Walcott saw the line forming and felt his throat go dry. These weren't scattered cowboys anymore. This was an army. Some rode under the sheriff's badge, others under nothing but the will to avenge Nate Champion. Every man in that line had something to settle. At 1:30 p.m., the first shot cracked across the valley, then another. Within seconds, the TA ranch was surrounded by the thunder of gunfire. Bullets chewed through the fences, splintered window frames, tore shingles from the roof. The invaders fired back in panic, smoke billowing from their rifles, but they were outnumbered nearly 10 to 1. Inside, the air filled with powder smoke and fear. A Texan crouched behind a pile of hay bales, muttering a prayer between shots. Another man pressed a bandage to his arm, the blood soaking through instantly. The Gatling gun they'd hauled all the way from Cheyenne jammed on its third burst, useless now except as dead weight. Outside, the posse advanced, using the ravines and brush for cover. They moved with the quiet precision of men who had hunted game all their lives. For hours, the battle raged. The sound rolled across the plains like thunder over water, echoing against the empty sky. When darkness fell, the gunfire slowed, replaced by the low hum of men whispering, reloading, sharpening knives. The cold crept in. From within the ranch came the moans of the wounded, the crackle of fire in the stove, the sound of boots pacing back and forth in desperation. Walcott sat by the window, his revolver in his lap, staring into the black night. He had written letters to the barons in Cheyenne, boasting of a swift victory. Now surrounded and shivering, he wondered if anyone would ever read them. At dawn, the posse brought out a new weapon, dynamite. Bundles of it, wired and ready. Two men crawled close under the cover of a ditch and hurled a stick against the north wall of the barn. The explosion shook the ground. Smoke and dust filled the air, and the defenders screamed as splinters rained down. A cheer went up from the hills. By mid-morning, a truce flag appeared from the ranch house, a white rag tied to a rifle barrel. The firing stopped for a moment, the silence almost too heavy to bear. A man stepped out, his face gray with smoke. "We've got wounded," he shouted. "We're done." But Sheriff Angus wasn't a man to take chances. He shouted back, "Lay down your guns and come out one by one." The invaders hesitated, looking to Walcott for an answer. He gave none. Inside, some begged to surrender. Others swore they'd never be taken alive. A few argued that the U.S. Army would come, that the government couldn't allow a mob to hang them all. They were right, though none of them could know that yet. Because even as the siege tightened, a telegraph was racing south from Buffalo, carried through storm and distance to Fort McKinney. It begged the commanding officer for intervention. State of insurrection. Send troops at once. Bloodshed imminent. The soldiers saddled up that afternoon. Back at the TA ranch, the fight flickered on like a dying fire. Shots still cracked from the windows, answered by volleys from the hills. The defenders were low on water, nearly out of food. Some tore pages from the Bible to roll cigarettes. Others just stared through the bullet holes at the endless prairie beyond, wondering how a war born in a boardroom had ended with them trapped in the dirt. By nightfall, rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, turning the ground to mud. The posse huddled under slickers, their campfires dimmed by the wind. From the ranch came no sound but the slow drip of rain on tin. Somewhere in the darkness a coyote howled. It was the only free voice left in the valley. When the dawn came again, so did the cavalry. Blue coats appeared on the southern ridge, sabers glinting, flags snapping in the cold wind. For the first time in days, both sides went silent. The soldiers rode down through the wet grass, their commander raising a hand for peace. The men of Johnson County believed salvation had come, that justice would finally be done. But as the troopers approached the ranch, something in the way they rode told a different story. They weren't coming to arrest the invaders. They were coming to protect them. The war was about to end, not with victory, but with betrayal. Then came the sound, a new rhythm against the earth. Faint at first, then rising like the beat of distant drums. Hoofbeats, heavy, measured, organized, the kind no cowboy made. Men looked up from their positions, squinting through the mist. On the southern ridge, a dark line appeared. Horses, riders in formation. The sun caught a flash of metal, the unmistakable glint of sabers. The morning of April 13th broke cold and gray over the Powder River Basin. The rain had frozen in the night, crusting the grass in white. The men of Johnson County, huddled in the gullies around the TA ranch, were stiff from 2 days of siege. Their rifles were wet, their tempers brittle. Through the fog they could see the ranch still standing, scarred and smoke-stained, its windows shot out, its roof riddled with holes. Inside, the invaders lay quiet, some bleeding, some praying, some just waiting. The war had turned into a slow grind of patience. Everyone was waiting for the next explosion, the next bullet. The cavalry, someone whispered. The column moved steadily down the slope, blue coats gleaming through the rain. At their head rode Colonel J.J. Van Horn of the 6th Cavalry, sent from Fort McKinney by order of the governor. He carried a telegram folded in his breast pocket, signed not by a local sheriff, but by the acting president of the United States himself. The message was simple: protect the prisoners and restore order. The prisoners, that was what the invaders were now called. For a moment, hope surged through the ranks. The men thought justice had come, that the army was here to finish what they'd started, to arrest the killers of Nate Champion, to end the tyranny of the cattle barons once and for all. Some even cheered. But the older ones, those who had seen enough of government to know better, stayed silent. Van Horn nodded once, but his eyes never softened. Be that as it may, my orders are clear. These men are to be taken into custody under military protection. Any interference will be considered rebellion against the United States government. Sheriff Angus rode forward, his face red with fury and cold. Colonel, he said, those men murdered 2 of our own. They burned Champion alive. We're not hostiles, we're citizens defending our land. When the troopers reached the valley floor, the shooting had already stopped. The posse lowered their rifles, watching as Van Horn rode between the lines. Mud splashed up the flanks of his horse, his boots dark with rain. He raised a hand to the sheriff. You will cease hostilities immediately, he said. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of command. No one contradicted him. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the grass. The men of Johnson County looked at one another, exhausted, mud-caked, hearts burning with the memory of what had been done at the KC Ranch. Then one voice rose from the back of the line. So the government's come to save the barons. The cavalry formed a perimeter around the TA Ranch. Soldiers entered the buildings cautiously, rifles at the ready. Inside, they found the invaders half dead from hunger and sleeplessness. The once proud gunmen who had ridden north like conquerors now looked more like ghosts, faces hollow, hands trembling as they handed over their weapons. Wolcott, pale and silent, offered his sword. Major Wolcott, Van Horn said curtly, you and your men are under military arrest. Outside, the posse watched in disbelief as the soldiers escorted the invaders out one by one, helping them mount horses, covering them with blankets, treating them not as killers but as men rescued from peril. When the last of them rode off under the army's protection, a murmur of rage rolled through the crowd. "They killed Nate for nothing," one man growled beyond. "And now they ride free." The sheriff tried to hold his men back, but their anger was too deep to soothe. They had fought for justice and been handed a lesson instead, that power protects its own. The same men who had ordered the killings were now safely on their way to Fort McKinney, guarded by soldiers paid with the same tax dollars as the cowhands who buried Champion. The cavalry left behind a valley littered with shell casings and burnt wood. The posse broke apart slowly, men turning their horses toward home, heads bowed, rifles slung low. Some cursed the government, others said nothing at all. Silence spread over the plains again, the kind that comes after a storm too big to understand. At Fort McKinney, the invaders were treated as prisoners for barely a week. Then came orders from Cheyenne, a promise of a fair investigation. Within days, they were released on bail provided by the very men who had sent them north. No charges stuck, no trials were held. The official report claimed there was insufficient evidence. In Johnson County, the news hit like another shot fired from a distance. It told the settlers what they already knew but hadn't wanted to believe. Justice on the frontier still belonged to the ones who could afford it. The barons would return to their mansions in Cheyenne, their boots polished, their reputations intact. The small cowboys would go back to their cabins, their debts, their graves. The war was over, but the wound it left was too deep to close. That spring, grass began to grow again over the ashes of the KC Ranch. Calves were born, rivers ran full, and the wind erased the tracks of men and horses alike. But beneath the calm, something had shifted forever. The open range had died, so had the myth of its masters. And far to the north, at the foot of the mountains, an unmarked grave still caught the morning light, where Nate Champion had fallen, facing 50 rifles with nothing but his own steady hand. The war ended not with surrender, but with silence. The kind that settles after thunder has passed, when even the land seems ashamed of what it's seen. Johnson County buried its dead and went back to the hard rhythm of survival. Fences were mended, cattle driven, barns rebuilt. But every man who rode the range in those years carried a memory he could not shake. The image of a burning cabin, the crack of rifles in the cold air, and the knowledge that truth had lost to power once again. The Stock Growers Association returned to Cheyenne and rewrote the story. In their version, the invaders had acted to preserve order. Newspapers printed the lie, and men in polished boots toasted it with imported whiskey. But out on the plains, no one believed them. The cowhands who'd watched Nate Champion stand alone, the women who'd fed the posse as they rode, the children who'd seen their fathers return mud-covered and bitter. They knew better. They had seen justice, and they had seen it denied. For a few years, the memory of the Johnson County War burned hot. Ballads were sung in bunkhouses, whispered over campfires where men rolled cigarettes with calloused hands. Nate's Stand, they called it, the song of one cowboy who'd fought the barons and held the line until the world took notice. But like all songs of the frontier, it faded. The barons grew old, their fortunes spent. The open range they fought to control was carved into homesteads and townships. Wire fences crawled across the prairie like scars. Still, the echoes remained. In the long summers, when the grass shimmered under the sun and the wind whistled through the posts, old men would point to the hills and say, "That's where it happened, that's where they burned him out." They said it not with rage, but with a quiet respect, the kind reserved for men who didn't bend when the world tried to break them. Nate Champion's grave lay unmarked for years until travelers began leaving stones there, one by one, until the pile rose higher than the grass. No monument, no plaque, just the simple tribute of hands that understood. The Johnson County War changed the West in ways few could see then. It marked the end of the open range, the beginning of law that belonged to towns instead of men. It told the small cowboys that courage alone couldn't outshoot money, but it also reminded them that courage was still worth something. Because without men like Nate, without their defiance, the story of the frontier would have belonged entirely to the powerful. In the decades that followed, the cattle barons lost their grip. Railroads took over where their herds had once roamed. Banks, not branding irons, ruled the land. The big outfits fell to smaller hands. Men and women who worked their own acres, raised their own stock, built fences not to divide but to protect. The dream that the barons tried to crush was not destroyed. It simply changed its shape. And as for Johnson County, time did what it always does. It buried the violence under layers of years and grass. But if you stand there today, near the bend of the Powder River, on a still morning when the sun breaks through the mist, you can almost hear it, the distant crack of gunfire, the shouts carried on the wind, the stubborn echo of a man's last stand. The people who came after didn't speak of revenge. They spoke of balance, of a time when the strong thought they could own the horizon and the weak proved they could defend it. They taught their sons that freedom wasn't a gift, it was a debt, paid in sweat, in patience, and sometimes in blood. History would move on, machines would come, and cities would rise, and the cowboy himself would turn into myth. But under that myth, under the romance and dust of 1,000 stories, there would always be the truth of Johnson County, the day when small men fought giants and refused to vanish. They didn't win in the way history counts victories. They didn't topple the rich or rewrite the law, but they did something rarer. They reminded the West and maybe the nation that dignity is worth defending, even when it costs everything. Out on that wind-scoured land, where the grass hums and the sky stretches forever, the story still lingers. You can feel it in the stillness, in the way the air holds its breath at sunset, in the way every cowboy's boots seem to echo just a little louder there. Because some places remember, and the land remembers the hands that shaped it, the strong, the stubborn, the small. They didn't build it perfect, but they built it honest,